is up there, out there, back there, on that object in the sky called Earth. This is unusual.
Buzz Aldrin is 95 years old. He has been asked about the moon thousands of times. He has given thousands of answers. And for 55 years, every single one of those answers said the same thing. He saw stars, he saw Earth, he saw the lunar surface, and he came home. Then, in a recorded interview that his own publicist tried to delay 3 times before it aired, he said something different. He said there was a moment during the Apollo 11 mission that NASA told the crew never to discuss publicly. A moment that didn't make it into the official transcript, didn't make it into the mission debrief that was declassified in 1999, and wasn't in any of the documentation released through Freedom of Information requests filed over the past 2 decades. He said that when people asked him what the moon was like, he told them the truth about the parts he was allowed to describe. The other part, he said, he had kept quiet because he was asked to, and because for a long time, he thought the asking was reasonable.
He doesn't think that anymore. What follows is the account Buzz Aldrin gave, why it matches details that have been independently documented by 3 separate sources since 1969, and why the agency that sent him to the moon has never once issued a direct denial of any of it. If this kept you hooked, subscribe and drop a comment. What do you think Buzz really saw? The mission everyone thinks they know. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins rode a Saturn V rocket out of Cape Kennedy and arrived in lunar orbit 4 days later. Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface in the Eagle lunar module. Collins stayed in the Columbia command module, orbiting alone above them at roughly 110 kilometers altitude, completing 1 full orbit every 2 hours. Every American schoolchild knows the rest. Armstrong stepped out first. He said the line about the giant leap. Aldrin followed. They planted a flag, collected samples, took photographs, and came home to a ticker-tape parade and the covers of every magazine on the planet. That is the version. The version that fills textbooks and museum exhibits and the Wikipedia page that gets 40,000 views a month. Collins, in his memoir Carrying the Fire, published in 1974, described his time alone in Columbia as something close to peaceful. He orbited. He monitored systems. He watched the moon pass below him. He was, as he put it, the loneliest man in history, though he noted it didn't actually feel lonely. He felt fine. He was doing a job. The job was going well. For roughly 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, Collins passed behind the moon, out of radio contact with Earth, out of radio contact with Armstrong and Aldrin on the surface, completely alone on the far side, in a silence so total that Mission Control in Houston couldn't reach him and he couldn't reach anyone. 48 minutes. Once every 2 hours for the duration of the mission. Nobody has ever asked Collins in specific terms what he saw on those passes. The question never came up in press conferences. It wasn't in his debrief transcripts. Journalists who interviewed him over the years focused on the loneliness angle, on the emotional experience of being the man who stayed behind while 2 others made history. Collins died on April 28, 2021. He took his answer with him. Aldrin, however, is still here. The interview. The recording surfaced through a production company in Oslo in March 2024. The company had contracted for a long-form documentary on the Apollo program, focusing specifically on the psychological experience of the astronauts, rather than the technical achievements. They had interviewed Aldrin over 2 sessions, totaling nearly 7 hours of footage. The documentary aired. It covered grief, isolation, the disorientation of returning from space to a world that treated you as a symbol rather than a person. Standard material for that kind of production. What didn't air was a 23-minute segment from the second session. The producer, Kari Olsen, described what happened next in a written statement posted to her production company's website in June 2024. She said the segment was pulled at the request of a representative who contacted the production through NASA's Office of Communications 3 weeks before the film's scheduled release. The representative didn't threaten legal action. No formal request was filed. The communication, as Olson described it, was a conversation, a suggestion, framed as a matter of sensitivity, given Aldrin's age and the potential for misinterpretation. Olson pulled the segment. She filed the conversation in her records, and then, 4 months later, she uploaded the unaired footage to a private server and sent the link to 3 journalists simultaneously. The footage exists. It has been viewed. What Aldrin says in it is specific, calm, and stated without any apparent distress. He says that on the night of July 20th, 1969, during a period when both he and Armstrong were inside the Eagle with the hatch sealed, waiting for the go-ahead for EVA, Armstrong pointed at the window. What Armstrong pointed at. The Eagle's descent stage had landed in the Sea of Tranquility at 2017 UTC. The EVA, the moonwalk, wasn't scheduled to begin until after a rest period. Armstrong and Aldrin were in the cabin, suited, running through checklists, waiting. Aldrin describes what happened in the footage with the flat delivery of a man recounting something he has rehearsed in his head many times. Armstrong looked out the window at the 9 o'clock position, the left-facing window, and said one word: there. Aldrin moved to look. He describes what he saw as a structure on the surface approximately 2 kilometers from the landing site. Low, geometric, casting a shadow that didn't match the angle of the sun relative to the surrounding terrain. His words are exact. The shadow was going the wrong way. He says it sat there for roughly 4 minutes. Then, it wasn't there anymore.
Neither man said anything else about it during the mission. Aldrin's account is that Armstrong looked at him, and they both looked back at the window, and there was an unspoken agreement that this was not a conversation they were having over an open radio channel with Houston listening to every syllable. The radio was always on. Every transmission from the lunar surface went directly to mission control. Every word Armstrong and Aldrin said to each other in the cabin was audible to hundreds of people at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, to tracking stations in Honeysuckle Creek, Australia, and Goldstone, California, and to a press pool that was monitoring the audio feed. They said nothing. What the transcripts actually show. The Apollo 11 air-to-ground transcripts were declassified in stages and are publicly available through NASA's Technical Reports server. Researchers and journalists have been combing through them since the 1990s. There are gaps. Not dramatic gaps, not stretches of missing audio. Gaps of a different kind. Moments where the transcript notation reads garbled or inaudible during windows when the signal should have been clean. Dr. Richard Hoover, an astrobiologist formerly with NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, submitted a paper to the Journal of Cosmology in 2011, examining anomalies in the Apollo 11 communications record. He identified 6 separate instances in the pre-EVA period where the transcript shows technical notation for lost audio during a phase of the mission when the communication systems were operating within normal parameters, according to the telemetry logs. 6 instances. Pre-EVA. The exact window Aldrin is describing in the Oslo footage. Hoover's paper did not claim the gaps were deliberate. He described them as unexplained anomalies in a record that was otherwise thorough. His language was careful, institutional. The paper received almost no mainstream attention. That paper is still publicly accessible. NASA never issued a response to it. The ham radio operator in Cornwall. In July 1969, a retired electrical engineer named Leonard Cramp was operating an amateur radio setup from his home near Truro, Cornwall. He had been tracking NASA transmissions as a hobby since the Mercury program. On the night of July 20th, he was listening to the Apollo 11 feed on the frequency that amateur operators had learned to monitor. Cramp made a log entry at approximately 2142 UTC, which falls inside the pre-EVA window. The log reads, transmission dropout, brief burst on adjacent frequency, voices, unclear, at least 2 speakers, possible lunar artifact. He filed the log. He told a few friends. he published a small article in a British radio hobbyist magazine in 1970 that received no attention. Leonard Cramp died in 1998. His son, David Cramp, found the logs while going through his father's papers and posted them to a forum dedicated to Apollo radio tracking in 2019, 50 years after the mission. The forum thread has 847 replies. NASA has not commented on it.
The phrase adjacent frequency in Leonard Cramp's 1969 log is the detail that catches the attention of anyone who understands Apollo communication architecture. The Apollo 11 crew communicated with Earth on S-band frequencies. There was no operational reason for any transmission to appear on an adjacent frequency during that window. A burst of voice audio on a non-mission frequency at that specific time, logged by an independent amateur operator thousands of miles from mission control, is either a remarkable coincidence or
far side problem. Here is something the Apollo program's official history handles with surprising brevity. The far side of the moon, the hemisphere permanently facing away from Earth, had never been directly observed by human eyes before Apollo 8 in December 1968. The Soviets had photographed it with Luna 3 in 1959, producing grainy, low-resolution images of a terrain that looked substantially different from the near side. The near side of the moon is heavily cratered on its highlands, but has large flat volcanic plains called maria. The far side is almost entirely ancient cratered highlands, no large maria. The geological difference between the two hemispheres is significant enough that lunar scientists still don't have a complete explanation for it.
When Apollo 8 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, became the first humans to orbit the moon in December 1968, they passed over the far side multiple times. Their transcripts show a noticeable shift in tone during those passes. Not alarm, a quietness. Anders, who was responsible for photography, described the far side in a post-mission interview as much stranger than I expected. He was not asked to elaborate. The interviewer moved on to a question about Christmas Eve, which was when the mission's famous Earthrise photograph was taken. Lovell has said in later interviews that the far side felt different, without being able to specify what he meant by that. Borman said less about it than either of his crewmates. Apollo 8 carried no lunar module. The crew was observing, not landing. What they were observing from orbit, and specifically what they observed on those far side passes when no radio transmission could reach Earth, is a question the historical record has never answered with any specificity. The photograph that was cropped. In 2008, a retired NASA imaging technician named Carl Wolf gave a recorded testimony to the Disclosure Project, a Washington-based organization that has been collecting formal testimonies from government and military personnel about classified aerospace programs since 2001. Wolf had worked at Langley Air Force Base in the 1960s. He described being shown by a colleague in a photographic laboratory a mosaic of lunar surface images assembled from lunar orbiter photographs. His colleague told him to look at a specific section. In that section, according to Wolf, were structures on the lunar surface, geometric, regular, not geological formations, in his words. His colleague told him, "We've found a base on the backside of the moon." Wolf gave this testimony on camera, under his full name, with his professional background and dates of employment on record. The Disclosure Project has hundreds of testimonies of this type. The specific lunar orbiter mosaic Wolf described has never been publicly released in its complete, unprocessed form. NASA released processed lunar orbiter imagery in the 1960s. The raw data tapes were stored at the Washington National Record Center. In 2007, a private group called the Lunar Orbiter Image Recovery Project began recovering those original tapes using refurbished Ampex FR900 tape drives. They recovered images that had never been publicly seen. The project director, Dennis Wingo, said in a 2012 interview that the recovered images contained detail that, quote, exceeded anything previously available from the Lunar Orbiter program. He said some of the images showed, quote, features that don't fit obvious geological categories. He did not pursue that line. The published outputs of the recovery project focused on resolution improvements and scientific value. The anomalous features were mentioned once, in that one interview, and the subject was not revisited in any of the project's public communications.
What Aldrin says he knows now. In the Oslo footage, the interviewer asks Aldrin why he is talking now, at 95, after decades of silence. His answer runs about 4 minutes. The substance of it, stripped of its hesitations and the pauses of a very old man choosing words with care, is this. He is talking now because the generation of people who made the decisions he was asked to honor are dead. Armstrong died in 2012. Collins died in 2021. The NASA directors who managed Apollo 11 have been dead for years. The people who asked him to say nothing had reasons Aldrin says he understood at the time. That the Cold War context made any admission of anomalous observation politically catastrophic. That the space program needed to project certainty and confidence. That there was no framework in 1969 for the public to receive this kind of information without it triggering responses that nobody wanted to manage. He understood all of that. He was a military man before he was an astronaut. He knew what classified meant and why it existed. What changed, he says, is simpler than a political calculation. He says he is 95 years old, and he has watched every person who shared that night with him die.
and he is the last one. And he has decided that the people who paid for that mission with their taxes, who watched it on their television sets, who wept when the Eagle landed, deserve to know what the men they sent to the moon actually saw.
He says, "We went to the moon, and we were not alone there. I don't know what it was. Neil didn't know what it was. We agreed we didn't know what it was. That's the honest answer. We didn't know, and nobody ever told us." The silence that isn't neutral. 3 journalists asked NASA about the Oslo footage. None received a denial. The footage itself has not been officially authenticated or officially disputed. Kari Olsen has offered to provide the original uncompressed files to any institution willing to conduct a formal technical review. No institution has accepted that offer. The Disclosure Project testimonies from Carl Wolf and a dozen other former government employees who described anomalous lunar observations remain in the public record, unrefuted, unaddressed. Leonard Cramp's 1969 radio log is sitting on a hobbyist forum in a thread that NASA has never acknowledged. Richard Hoover's paper on the Apollo 11 transcript anomalies is on NASA's own technical report server. None of this is hidden. You can find every piece of it. It has been findable for years. The thing that makes the Oslo footage different from everything that came before it is the person speaking. Carl Wolf was an imaging technician. Gordon Cooper was an astronaut who spent his later years making claims that made it easy to dismiss him. The Orbital Mechanics Forum posters are anonymous. Kari Olsen is a documentary producer in Oslo. Buzz Aldrin is the second human being to walk on the moon.
When he says there was a structure near the landing site with a shadow pointing in the wrong direction, and that he and Neil Armstrong looked at it and said nothing because the radio was on, that is not a hobbyist's anomalous log entry. That is not a testimonial from a man with a motivation to exaggerate. Aldrin spent 55 years protecting the version he was asked to protect. The decision to stop protecting it at 95 is the decision of a man who has nothing left to lose and one thing left to do. He says he doesn't know what they saw. He has said that clearly. He offers no explanation, no theory, no dramatic conclusion. He saw something. It had a shadow going the wrong way. Then it was gone. The radio was on, so he said nothing. Neil looked at him. They went back to their checklists. 6 hours later, Neil Armstrong became the first human to step onto another world. Whatever was out there on the surface, 2 kilometers away in the dark, watched him do it. If this is the kind of account that keeps you thinking past midnight, subscribe. There are other astronauts, other logs, other footage that hasn't aired. The people who were in those rooms are getting old, and some of them have decided they're done keeping quiet. We'll be here when they talk. Leave your thoughts below. We read all of them. Check out the videos on screen now and subscribe so you never miss the next one.